Hola, ¿cómo estás, Austin? How are you?
Hola, muchos buenos, señorita.
Sí, está bien. Um, so today we're covering Mexican history, and people forget Latin America exists, um, which is partly justified and partly not, in that if you choose not to study Latin America in the history of the world, you can generally maintain your narrative of world history if you ignore Latin America. It's the same issue that India and Africa and Southeast Asia run into. At the same time, what you're effectively doing is you're cutting out the vast majority of the human condition, where our current narrative of history is mostly written for uh, educated West European intellectuals. And our narrative of history is getting progressively smaller as people know less history. Um, where as of now, expecting normies to know about World War I is just out of the pale, or expecting them to know about basic facts of the American Revolution is again beyond the pale, which is sad. But Mexico's got a pretty interesting history. One of the more interesting in North America because Mexico is the only Mexico and if you throw in Guatemala and El Salvador is the only place in North America where you had a pre-established native civilization that has survived until the present in some form, with half of Mexico's blood being of native origin today.
Right. We touched on that the last episode where it's kind of a surprising statistic most people don't realize. Um, and yeah, I think the most interesting period of Mexican history that I know the least about or that I would find would be the most interesting to expound upon would be kind of the early colonial history in the
Yeah,
1500s and 1600s.
I'm making so uh the part two Jewish civilization video is basically done, and the video I'm writing now is Mesoamerica. So you're gonna have a Mesoamerican civilization video on the main channel, and then we're making the Mexican history, where I was in Mexico for a month a few weeks ago, and I spent a lot of time in Mexico. It's a country I've grown quite fond of, and I read up a lot on Mexican history, which is why I'm making this video. And the reason I'm roping it back to your point is one of the best history books I've ever read is Fire and Blood by Fehrenbach. And this guy ran the Texas Historical Association, and it's a civilizational analysis of the history of Mexico. And what he says is that you can split Mexican history into three different subsections. The first is tyranny by the land, which is under the natives, tyranny by the Spanish, under the colonial period, and then the tyranny of the past with independence. And he said in each case, Mexico has this key issue where it can't hit escape velocity of breaking out of its context, because great nations are capable of basically cleaning up their own act, so much so to the point that they start organically spilling all around them, where great nations don't make the decision to be great. It's just they clean up their acts to a degree where they're innately superior enough that they just gradually consume their entire ecosystem. That's Rome, that's Britain, that's the ancient Greeks, the Chinese, etc.
That makes sense because if you're trying to force it, it's not going to happen
Yeah,
anyways. And if it's going to happen, it's not conditional to you forcing it. And then people put the cart before the horse when they get to the end of those empires and try and
yeah.
figure out how they're supposed to maintain them. It's like, hey, maybe restore the generating force.
There's two kinds of empires. They're the ones that form organically, like the ones I described before, where Britain, Rome, America never really intended to form empires, it kind of just happened. In a lot of cases, if you asked their elite at any given time for each of those three powers, in their imperial growth, their elite would say, "We don't want an empire. We don't want these colonies." It just gradually happened. And then you have the great man empires, examples of which are the Macedonians under Alexander, Napoleon, Genghis Khan, And what happens is that you take a people who are militarily superior to their neighbors in a certain way, and then they just roll the dice and get supremely lucky on an incredible leader. And then that leader conquers the empire. And unilaterally, the issue all of those empires get is that um, is that they can't maintain it. Because once that leader is gone, they split up into different sub factions that that can't really maintain themselves, and that happened with each of those three empires. With for
Right.
Napoleon, it just did the empire didn't survive.
It's like a temporary super organizing principle where you can squeeze the juice out of an orange,
Yeah.
but without the orange tree, and like, you can get a boost or whatever,
Yes.
but not make it last.
So Mexico's got the longest history of any North American country, and I was in Oaxaca, which has the ancient site of Monte Alban, and that site stems back to 500 BC at least. And with the ancient world, especially with the ancient New World, assume everything is vastly older than you think. Where if the site goes back to 500 BC, assume it's 1500 BC actually. The oldest sites in Mesoamerica, and I want to make an independent video just on Mesoamerican civilization. So because they were doing all their own stuff that I don't want to squeeze into the total narrative of Mexican history, where the Olmec were the oldest civilization in Mesoamerica, and they were based around, I believe, Tabasco, where so many Mexican states have just become known for various food products. And Tabasco is the area around the Gulf of Mexico where there's a lot of oil production. And it's a tropical climate. It's one of the few jungles in Mexico. And Fehrenbach does this really well. He explains the different trajectories of Mesoamerican civilization, where it's hard to put the pieces together because, first of all, the Spanish destroyed most of the records. And secondly, this is a study that just didn't have that many records in the first place. And a thing with ancient societies in general is they tend to prioritize completely different things than us. The thing they tend to write is mythology, and their understanding of mythology is that it's symbolic and that's okay. And so when you're reading the things that they prioritize, it's like the Popol Vuh, where these two brothers go to the underworld and kill demons. That's very important to them, but that's not how our society perceives the world. And so Fehrenbach does a really good job of reading between the lines of the different subcultures in Mesoamerica and how they developed. And through that, he's clearly studied all the authors I read, like Spengler or Carol Quigley or these civilizational thinkers. And so he's fitting Mesoamerican civilization into those civilizational cycles, which of course, I love that. That's my thing. And as I said before, the first Mesoamerican civilization were the Olmec. And there's been this theory that the Olmec were black because the skulls, the statues they make look like black people. And so there's all these theories that black people sailed from Africa to Mexico 3,000 years ago. And that's relatively unlikely. Black people didn't even make it to Madagascar until 1,000 years ago, which is right off the coast of Africa. And what probably happened instead is that, as we spoke about in the last Native American video, that the racial composition of North America thousands of years ago was vastly different than today, which is why we have the Kennewick man, who is a European skull in Oregon from 9,000 years ago. It's why we found an Australian Aboriginal guy in the Amazon, where all of these discrete racial groups mix together to form Native Americans. And in Native American ancestry, we have this genetic group who are Australian Aboriginals, are a population called Negritos. And the Negritos are a Pacific Islander population, the indigenous people of Southeast Asia. And people constantly confuse them for Africans. But the thing is, they're not actually Africans. They have a similar look in a similar skin tone due to inhabiting similar climates, but they're genetically as different from Africans as anyone else. And so when you're looking at the Olmec, assume that it's a sort of like Australian Aboriginal Negrito population, which we mentally assort as African because that's the thing that we're most familiar with in America.
Right. And yeah, I don't think they had the sailing technology. The Canary Current is right off the coast, so if they did have the sailing technology of the Phoenicians, they could get swept out there. But yeah, I think that's pretty unlikely. And it sounds like you have every area except for Africa ended up inhabiting North America and forming the Indian identity. It's the spillover server or something for everyone out of Africa.
Yeah, exactly. Keep in mind that with the way this worked, where they were going over the North Pacific, is that Africa is as far away from the North Pacific as possible.
Right.
So it makes sense where all of these peoples were concentrated around Asia, and Asia had a completely different ethnic composition then too. But the thing Fehrenbach talks about is that the start of Mesoamerican culture was shamanism, where Olmec culture puts a high premium on shamanism, where shamans are individual mystics. And in shamanic cultures, it's about increasing the individual mystic's power, where shamans go to the underworld and they kill demons and they gain power. And then upon suffering in hell and killing demons, they return back to the physical world with heightened gifts, and they use it to try to help their people. And so all religions start with mystics and magicians, and then you systematize them until you hit a religious bureaucracy for the general public. And then what occurs is that that religion becomes so distant from God due to the bureaucratization that it's incapable of actually providing people spiritual solace. And so a new religion emerges that reconnects people with God directly. Happens to every major world religion. And that also happened in Mesoamerica, where Mesoamerica has one of the strangest religions I have seen of any society in the world, where I'm going to keep shilling Fehrenbach because he's that good. I ordered a few. I ordered a few of his other books because I was impressed. Where one of the points he makes, and this is the thing about Carlyle. I was reading Carlyle. He's also amazing. I also ordered Carlyle's other catalog, where he said when you're looking at these ancient cultures, we tend to see their religious ideas as abstractions because our society is so autistic and depersonalized and so what's the word? Our society is so disassociated that we
Left
can't.
brain.
Yeah, exactly. And this is one of the things I think about because when you have PTSD, you end up disassociating a lot, and so you intellectualize things. And so we did that as a society, and we can't actually perceive these ancient people authentically believing the things they say because we don't authentically believe anything. And but
Yeah.
one of the things that Carlyle says is that when you're looking at early Christianity or Norse paganism or the Prophet Muhammad, is that people authentically believe these things because they're symbolic representations of their lived reality. And our
Mm.
beliefs in a lot of ways are sillier than theirs. Stuff like equality or the blank slate are the things I constantly harp on, or progress happening just because. So I don't want to throw stones when we live in a glass house. But Mesoamerican religion's kind of horrifying, where there's the god of flayed skin, there is the Cthulhu monster god Tlatelolco, who has 10 different tentacle arms. Top Aztec god Huitzilopochtli is the sun god who demanded millions of sacrifices in order for the sun to rise every morning. And in Mesoamerican rituals, again, we all know the human sacrifice. And the human sacrifice was horrifying, and we've downplayed the scale of it. But the Aztecs killed 2 million people. But the Aztecs were a culmination of the Mesoamerican tradition. They were the worst iteration of this, where the Aztecs would kill thousands of people in one day. And for the Mayans, they'd kill like 60 people at most for human sacrifice. So it
Mm.
was a manageable scale until the end of Mesoamerican civilization. But there was lots of stuff where in Aztec feasts, they would eat the flesh of the men they sacrificed. or they would take the flayed skin of the people they destroyed and wear it as garments in religious rituals. And loads of stuff like that. The Maya would cut open their own, would cut open the nobility's testicles to take the testicle blood and then burn it with paper as a religious offering. So this is a highly heavy metal civilization, and this is how they. Oh yeah, the Mayans would also, they would have religious rituals where they'd throw people into cenotes, and cenotes are these open. There's these sort of ponds, and the Yucatan doesn't have any major rivers, and the Yucatan, its geography is heavily impacted by it being the main place where the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs hit. And
Wow.
so these deep ponds, they're the main source of water in the interior Yucatan, and they're the shattered out remnants of the places the asteroid knocked through. And there are certain mineral types in the Yucatan that only exist there from the asteroid. And so the Maya would throw men in these cenotes, wait until they're nearly dead, see their entire life flash before their eyes, have spiritual experiences, pull them out the moment before they die, and then interview them at what they saw.
Wow. And why would they almost die in these cenotes? Would they get dragged down by a current or something, or was it just like treading water?
I think they just threw people who couldn't swim.
Okay, because I'm picturing the Disney movie El Dorado, and I know that there was a current in that one.
There's no current in the cenotes. I lived in the Yucatan for like 6 months. I spent a month in Oaxaca and like 6 months in the Yucatan. I've been to like six provinces in Mexico. Mexico is a very diverse country, which is something Americans don't think. And there's no current in the cenotes. They're basically just these ponds, and they go really deep because they were hollowed out by the asteroids. So lots of cenotes, literally, I think they're like 70 feet deep. It's something ridiculous like that.
And did they get any information about the afterlife out of that? Probably got some good.
So I want to emphasize that there was differentiation among the Mesoamericans in their religion. There were broader gods like Quetzalcoatl had a lot of different archetypes in different areas. And Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec god, he was an originally very obscure god that gained dominance due to the Aztecs rising from obscure swamp bandit peoples to the dominant empire. And the Maya had an incredibly developed underworld mythology where their understanding was that the human world and all of life is this pale imitation of this infinitely deep underworld, and that we are the archetypal dreaming of said underworld. And the Popol Vuh, the big religious document we still have from the Maya, was based off two brothers having to go on a quest through the underworld to, I think, lift. I forget exactly. I think it's like lifting a curse. And
Two brothers.
exactly. And the Popol Vuh is really weird. I read it once, and I can't really remember the plot, but I remember being like, what did I just read at the time? And so they conceptualized their mythology as the underworld, and Mesoamerica is probably the most heavy metal civilization ever, where you look at their standards of beauty, they would shove a wooden plank through your through your lip as a thing of beauty. They would elongate your skull like a Martian as a sign of beauty, and all that sort of thing.
Wow. Why were they looking for all these signs for beauty? Couldn't they just have like regular beauty? But uh, yeah, that's insane. That's a very heavy metal civilization. It fits with, like you said, the sacrifice, because you're kind of sacrificing your own body there. But the the scale and the unmanageability of the sacrifice is because it's basically was their replacement for war, right? It was their way of like eliminating the surplus population absent improvement of social institutions.
Yes.
And so it's like war is super horrifying, but when you turn war into an assembly line and a ritual and you're trying to get the same body count, it's almost even, it's like way too intentionally and consciously consistently sadistic. At least
Yeah.
with war, it's like a rage, and you're like, oh well, that was messed up. Maybe we shouldn't have done that. But this is a continual slow drip way of life, and it sounds like the population kept increasing and they were unable to improve their social institutions, and then they had other ecological problems with the system, and so they just tried to ramp it up towards the end to the point where the dynamic just broke
Yes.
down.
That was the Aztecs, and I'm clarifying that because the Aztecs, they are to the rest of Mesoamerican civilization, they are the industrial grade parody of Mesoamerica, where they're taking all these social institutions that function on a smaller scale, and because the Aztecs were the first people to unify the entire sea to shining sea of Mexico, they took these social institutions, put them on what's effectively an industrialized scale, and so you're seeing them for all their horror. Where the Aztecs had
Mm.
this concept called the Flower Wars, where they were the Aztecs were the triple alliance of Tlatelolco, Tenochtitlan, and a third state, Texcoco, and they conquered the whole region, and they demanded sacrifices where the way they got them is they had these things called the Flower Wars, where they had all these subject states. And the equivalent would be, imagine if America had these simulated wars with Great Britain, which is effectively our vassal state. I'm sorry, it's true. And the British were forced to lose these wars, and then we used them for human sacrifice in order to honor George Washington. And you said before in our Age of Exploration video, it's deeply dystopian, where it's these false
Mhm.
simulated wars the other side has to lose in order to generate this industrial grade human sacrifice. And Matthew White, who's the big atrocities historian, he puts the number as 2 million. And Matthew White's really fair. He's bipartisan. He reads all the historians. And there's several historic time periods where Matthew White is like, whatever narrative that you believed was biased about this time period is actually correct. And he pulls that for the Aztecs and for the gladiatorial games, where the gladiatorial games in Rome killed an equivalent amount of people, or 2 million, for the entertainment of the Roman audiences.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot. I didn't know actually that many people died in the arena.
Keep in
That's
mind
a
that,
quite a large
so
number.
Mexico at the time of Spanish conquest had 20 million people, which is equivalent to France's population at the time. Germany had 11 million. The Holy Roman Empire had 20 million. England had 4 million. Spain had 10 million. So it was a relatively large amount of people. And when you're looking at Rome, Rome had like 70 to 100 million over a period of centuries. So when you're operating at 100 million people, where the
Mm.
Romans had huge entertainment industry, over the course of centuries, 2 million deaths is not that much.
Right. Okay. And what was the period of the Aztecs 2 million deaths? How long was that
So
period?
that occurred over a very short period, and it's for
Okay.
interesting reasons as well. And this gets into one of the big themes for Mesoamerica, where I want to emphasize the time scale here, where the Olmec are in 1200 BC, the Aztecs are in 1500 AD. In between hand, you saw many different civilizations. So the Olmec were first, then the Olmec died out by like 200 BC. Then the Maya were like 1000 BC until like 1000 AD. They were in the Yucatan. The Toltec formed around the central valley of Mexico. The Toltec were like roughly the birth of Christ until like 1000 AD, and they culminated in Teotihuacan. Or wait, no, Teotihuacan was pre-Toltec. And then the Toltecs were barbarians who came down from the north. And the Toltecs were a medieval civilization. The Aztecs formed in the high medieval period. They're like in the 13th century. And they unified that region a few generations before the Spanish arrived. And in Oaxaca, they had their own civilization that went back to 500 BC. And the interesting mechanism with Mesoamerica is that they had these highly complex calendars. And these calendars existed to simulate the El Nino, where Mexico's got a very dry climate, where it's already on the edge of subsistence. And another variable here is that because there weren't any domesticated animals, the Mexicans were completely dependent on the Three Sisters, or corns, beans, and squash. And when it didn't rain, they couldn't rely on goats or sheep or the things that Eurasians would have. So they were at the mercy of the irrigation and the rain. And so the El Nino is this pattern in the South Pacific's rain, where there'll be multi-decade periods with almost no rain and then multi-decade periods of flooding. And the Mesoamericans had arguably the most advanced calendar ever because I think they were trying to guess when the El Nino would happen. And so with this weird mechanism, you saw Mesoamerican civilization fit this pattern where a civilization arises, it collapses after a few centuries. Another distinct civilization arises in another part of Mexico. It collapses. And so the Aztecs knew that they were, I think they said they were they called it the fifth sun. They were the fifth cycle of civilization, where the Aztecs said every cycle, civilization grows, the gods hate them, the gods wipe them out, and they wipe them out through jaguars, through flooding, through earthquakes, and all of those things. And the Aztecs, their priest class predicted they were the fifth sun, and their civilization would not last past them. That this was the last time their civilization would exist. And the really freaky thing is they predicted the exact year their civilization would collapse due to comets and in calendars. And so when the Spanish arrived, they were like, holy shit, this is actually our end. And so the reason that they ramped up the human sacrifices so much is that they knew that their civilization was about to die. And so they were begging the sun god, Huitzilopochtli, if we kill millions of people, will you please let our civilization survive another cycle?
You know what it sounds like? It sounds like because killing people was their mechanism for social control, the
Yeah.
bloodletting to manage the population and the resources, etc. And as their society was failing, they exponentially increased their mechanism for social
Yes.
control. And our mechanism of social control is the ability to print dollars. And as we fail, we're exponentially increasing our
Yes.
mechanism of social control. So it's an interesting analogy.
One of the things that, like, one of the patterns I found in history is that a society under pressure normally doubles down on its worst trait. So a
Right.
lot of Asian civilizations that fossilized and were too socially conservative, when the Europeans arrived, they became even more socially conservative, which is what you saw in Islam really recently with ISIS or the Taliban. The Nazis killed more Jews when they knew they were going to lose the war. And we are becoming even more leftist, even more inflationary as our civilization falls. It's not going to fall because we're going to stop it from falling.
Exactly.
But the Mesoamericans, they killed more people when they knew their civilization was going to end. And there's a sort of divine irony to it that they thought that the practice that the rest of history would judge them the most for would be the thing that they would save them. And one of the things Fehrenbach talked about, which is really good, is he said the Spanish conquest completely shattered the Mesoamerican concept of their sense of self, because first of all, they saw this completely distinct civilization that actually I don't want to get into that now, and it's spoilers. We'll get there. Put a pin in there. But yes, that's a very good point. And speedrun Mesoamerica, because I'm going to keep this short because it probably deserves its own video, and we need the rest of Mexican history. You have these multiple civilizations. The height of Mesoamerican civilization was around 800 AD, where you have the pre-classical period, which is before the birth of Christ. You have the classical period, which roughly approximates the European Dark Ages, which was the high point of Mesoamerican civilization, roughly 800 AD. And then Mesoamerica saw civilizational collapse, a little bit for the birth of Christ, around the 10th century AD, and then in the 16th century with the Spanish. And they had the fifth sons. There's probably two we don't know about, because I expect them to know their history, that there were 5 civilizational collapses they kept track of. And there was this profound unity of civilizational symbols and stuff across Mesoamerica. So you see the same artistic styles and patterns between the Olmec and the Aztecs. I mean, the feathered serpent, the pyramids, jade, chocolate being the currency, and all those things. And so it's this singular civilization that keeps stopping and starting, never really able to hit the critical mass where it can self-sustain. It's like an Asimov novel. And they feel completely indebted to a brutal natural environment they can never master. And so the greatest native sites, I would say, are Teotihuacan, which is um, outside Mexico City, and I've been there. I had a horrific migraine there, one of the worst migraines of my life. The Mesoamerican sites, and I've been like a dozen different Mesoamerican old cities, they have this eerie feeling to them I haven't felt anywhere else in the world. It's difficult to articulate, where I climbed the top of this pyramid in Teotihuacan, and I had a horrific migraine, and I was in pain for 4 hours straight, with stabbing pain in my stomach and my head. I get migraines where I go blind, and I have stabbing stomach and head pains. I haven't had them in 2 years, but I used to get them really frequently. Um, and and so Teotihuacan was the high point of their civilization, and their artistic height of complexity was around that Dark Age period. So you could argue that the Aztecs were an era of civilizational decline after their former greatness, although the Aztecs had the greatest degree of political and social scale they were operating under.
Right. Sounds like a really frustrating process with
Yeah,
the kind of water version of Game of Thrones where, drought is coming, young one, and
exactly.
they are never able to get started. And it's like you can probably feel like you're going insane. Happens 5 times in a row, culminating with a mass sacrifice, probably creates some pretty negative psychic energy.
Yeah, the impression I get is that something really bad happened in the history of Mesoamerica that we don't know about. It wouldn't surprise you if there was some horrifying political or
Mm,
social event, because you don't get conditions like this for nothing. Um, and
right. What happened to you?
yeah, yeah. Um, so there was a huge earthquake in Teotihuacan, and they just completely abandoned it. We don't really know why. And Teotihuacan, the later Toltec people called it the land of the gods because they had no idea how anyone could build anything as advanced as Teotihuacan through their dark age. And the Maya collapse happened in a similar time where the Maya had these highly advanced city states that were constantly at war, like Tikal or Chichen Itza or like Palenque. And the Mexicans also had barbarian invasions, where we think the Aztecs came from the modern US, where they spoke a language related to Comanche. And so the Aztecs came down from the north, and the Toltec invaded the Yucatan, establishing a state there. And the one Maya state that survived their collapse was Chichen Itza in the north under Toltec governance, where the Maya had a complete civilizational collapse, where the Yucatan in 1000 AD has a higher population than the Yucatan today, where the Yucatan's all trees. I drove across the Yucatan, and it's more empty than Canada. And the Yucatan was completely deforested with these huge cities. And civilizational collapses largely happen for the same reasons around the world. And we don't really know what caused the Maya collapse, but it's always a combination. Barbarian invasions, um, the peasants stop seeing a stake in the pre-established social structure. Um, the uh, the society becomes too top heavy. I imagine that it was these oppressive temple priest societies like the Bronze Age, and so
mhm.
when the priests couldn't get rain, which was their big raison d'etre, that the peasants thought, you guys can go screw yourselves. Your one job, or one of your biggest job, is getting rain and pleasing the gods. The gods clearly don't like you, so we're not listening to you. And so the
Right.
Maya language survived until the present, where the Spanish defeated the last Mayan state in 1697, and then the Maya rebelled again in Mexico, and the modern Mexican government only defeated the last Mayan rebels in 1903. So the
Really
Maya have been
interesting.
doing their own thing forever, and they're still Maya today. But the Maya stopped being this advanced, developed civilization, and the Aztecs were. I'm so excited to show you guys the Mesoamerican civilization video because I want to keep this video a rough, approximate length, and there's too much going on in Mesoamerica, so I'm purposely keeping out details so we have time to talk about the Spanish and the modern Mexico. But the Aztecs were a barbarian, poor desert people, where in the central valley of Mexico, or modern Mexico City, which used to be this temperate climate, wooded paradise around Lake Texcoco, is that the Toltec kingdoms, they forced the Aztecs, or as they call themselves, the Mexica. Mexico is from Mexitco, or what the Aztecs called their own country. The Mexica were forced into this uninhabitable swamp in the middle of Lake Texcoco, where they established a city-state, and they were known for their toughness. And so, through having to deal with this harsh society, they also had an incredible leader who I forget who name. I think his name was Kukulkan, but I'm probably getting that wrong. Where the Aztecs formed this trinity of allying with Texcoco and Texcoco, and I'm forgetting the third one, where it was this alliance where the Aztecs had a strategic genius. They had a warlord, and then the leader of, it was either Texcoco or Tetzlatlicocopta, I forget. The other city-state they allied with was run by this philosopher strategic genius who actually helped develop the Mesoamerican concept of monotheism, where Mesoamerican philosophers had developed the concept of monotheism, but it hadn't percolated down through the population. And they were able to form this confederacy that could conquer the entire region, probably because the rest of Mesoamerican civilization was in this sort of state of decay. And the Aztecs over time became more oppressive, where they were originally a form of aristocratic democracy. And their speaker, or dictator, gradually turned himself into king, superseding the tribal councils, and Tenochtitlan started oppressing the other states. And the Aztecs were interesting because they had like no chill. They were this authoritarian, communitarian, highly aggressive, warlike society, where the rest of Mesoamerican civilization was more laid back. But if you compare the Aztecs and the Nazis, that's the thing Fehrenbach literally does. It's not an unfair comparison. And so when
I thought Assyrians, which is also
Assyria's,
compared to the
yeah,
Nazis.
Assyria is a better comparison than the Nazis. And another thing is that around 1000 AD, you saw a switch from the priest class dominating to the warrior class, where a reason the Aztecs gained such military dominance is they established this warrior nobility like knights who are the jaguar and the eagle warriors, where they had this marked military advantage through establishing this noble class. And they developed this good social structure that balanced the interests of the common people and the nobility and the monarchy and the priest class. And so the Aztecs were highly unified. And when the Spanish reached Mexico, this was their read on it. They admired the military ferocity of the Aztecs. They admired how polite they were. They admired their degree of morality. They were horrified with the human sacrifice. Oh, they admired how clean Mexico was. They admired how populous it was, where Tenochtitlan had more people than any city in Europe except Constantinople. And they had turned Lake Texcoco into this beautiful irrigated farmland where the Mexicans would build these floating farms out in the lake.
Yeah.
And
I've been to the only floating farm in the world left right now is in Myanmar, in their
so
lake,
dope.
which we talked about. And it's wild going through a floating farm because you take a canoe through and you can move the rows and it looks like a farm because all the rows are spaced out. It's really cool. So I imagine that must have been something amazing for them to see too.
Yes. And the Spanish thought the Aztecs were innately demonic, and so when they conquered the region, they just burned everything down because they thought this is a satanic civilization that we just do not want to partake in. And they thought the Aztecs were innately cruel and inhuman and all of those things. And with the Spanish's arrival, which occurred very rapidly, and I feel kind of sorry for the Mexicans because Cortez arrived in Mexico, and Cortez was the Spanish commander, arrived in Mexico, and within less than 2 years of discovering the existence of the Aztec Empire, he had conquered them and burned their capital to the ground, which it's War of the Worlds. The Aztecs didn't even know who the Spanish were before they arrived. And the Aztecs called them gods, and this was a controversial thing. But the way to conceive it is that in the Aztec culture, the creek can be a god, the mountain is a god. They viewed their kings as gods because in the pre-axial age world, everything is innately divine. This glass of milk could be divine if there was a miracle that occurred around it. And Cortez showed up, and I admire Cortez on a Nietzschean level, and he's probably the most admirable of the conquistadors, which is such a low bar. But he actively tried to restrain the Spanish from doing horrific things to the Aztecs, although it didn't really work. Because when you look at the conquistadors, imagine them as the archetype of a Russian guy who sells Bitcoin in Miami. Imagine if they formed a military together. And they formed alliances of these people who hated the Aztecs, like the Tlaxcala, which is, I used to pronounce them Tlaxcala, which is unpronounceable. And they got all of these things that hated the Aztecs to support them. So 90% of the Spanish army were native. And the Spanish arrived, the Aztecs invited them to the capital because they fulfilled the prophecy of Quetzalcoatl, which is an interesting story. I have a theory there. I'll talk in the other video, but if you're interested, you can ask me. I have a theory who Quetzalcoatl was. And so they came to the capital. They seized the emperor. They used the emperor to get a lot of gold, which they then accidentally dropped in the lake. So a lot of the Spanish didn't actually make that much money from conquering Mexico because when they were fleeing the capital, they dropped the gold in the lake and they weren't able to retrieve it. So they seized the capital, demanded the Mexicans give them stuff, which actually worked because it was such a hierarchical communitarian society that even after the emperor had been captured by a foreign population, the people still served them. They got too oppressive. Then they tried to flee. They had a lot of losses. The Aztecs followed them out to the place they fled further east in Tlaxcala. The Spanish were able to wipe out a vastly larger army at the Battle of Otumba using a cavalry charge. And interestingly, the Spanish's biggest military advantage was with cavalry and steel, not with guns, because guns had issues firing in Mexico's humid climate. And the Mexicans had no basis on how to fight cavalry, and they none of their weapons could cut through European steel armor. So,
how many people did they have in the cavalry charge?
Cortez had like less than 1,000 men total, so probably less than 100 cavalry.
Why are cavalry charges so effective? Like in the last episode in the Frontier, we talked about it.
I grew up in a place with a lot of horses, and horses are terrifying. They weigh like 1,000 pounds, and they're charging at you. And European militaries had to spend thousands of years developing all these techniques to hold against cavalry. And even in the medieval period, a handful of knights could wipe out much larger armies of infantry. So the Europeans, they struggled to fight against cavalry, and you put them against the natives who have no background in it, and it's just slaughter. Where cavalry can wipe out vastly larger armies, you're effectively fighting against a tank. And the only way to really counter cavalry is with pike warfare, which demands immense cohesion and the development of a social structure which can get these guys to stand together. It's actually hard
and the confidence.
Exactly.
Yeah, and the confidence that you can actually stop it. Because like you said, you were going to say probably it's hard to actually get people to stand in a line and not move when they get charged by horses or something like that.
Yeah, this is one of the things.
And they also thought that they were gods when they were on the horses for a while, so that helped too, I guess.
Yeah, they said the Spanish were riding elk because they didn't know what a horse was. They said it was a giant. It was an elk.
That makes sense.
Joe Rogan, and so in the time between the first attack and the second attack, Mexico faced European diseases, which killed 90% of the population. And so Mexico's population in the year 1600 was 10% of what it was in the year 1500. It had 2 million people in 1600. and it had 10 million. It had 20 million people in 1500. So this is effectively nuclear war, sci-fi, Mad Max levels of horror. And after the disease, the Spanish were able to build these huge barge armies to attack Tenochtitlan by land, and they burned the Aztec capital to the ground, which is why if you go to Mexico City, you'll find practically no Aztec buildings. And on top of that, the Spanish built their empire using the Aztec imperial structures. And the natives were defeated as much by psychological breaking of their worldview as the actual fighting, because what occurred was so traumatic that the natives had no concept on how to deal with it, and they complied with the Spanish afterwards. And Cortez divided Mexico up between his various officers, and the general trend in Latin America is that 12 families own a majority of the economy. In almost every Latin American country, that's still the case. And in also most cases, those 12 families are the descendants of the initial conquistadors, where Latin America today is an aristocratic society with these hereditary wealthy families that are the descendants of the original conquerors, or the conquistadors. And Cortez could have named himself an independent king of Mexico, but he chose not to out of patriotism. And there was enormous faith in the shared Spanish project, where Spain in the year 1500 was an incredibly vigorous, manly, intrepid society. And it's sad to see how over time the growth of big government in Spain, watch the Spanish Empire video, drained it of its initiative.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting to think about because you're getting kind of a revival in South American politics, and that's going to have an impact on Spain because they're still connected to their diaspora, and the language is also similar. So I think you could see that it might be one of the few examples of reverse colonization that's actually good, where they teach the Spanish how to get out of their socialist malaise, because Spain is incredibly bureaucratic.
Malay will get them out of their malaise.
Yes, exactly. But
And so the Spanish originally enslaved the local population, and there was a push against that where the Spanish government actually went to profound effort to help the Indians, or the Indios as they called them, keep them from degrading slavery, where there are three interest groups in Spanish America, and Spanish America is 1500 until 1800 roughly, those being the monarchy, the nobility, and the church. And the natives have been forced into the ground on such a level that they had lost all leadership ability, where most native communities were actually self-governing for most of this time period, where the Spanish gave the natives their own reservations, and these reservations frequently made up a majority of Mexico's population. So when we have Indian reservations in America, there are these tiny out-of-the-way places, but the Indian reservations in Mexico were huge, and they're these pre-established societies, and people like the Tlaxcala who worked with the Spanish had functional independence until the Mexican independence, where the Tlaxcala actually acted as a nobility inside Mexico, where
it's yeah, it sounds like they created special economic zones more
yes,
than reservations for themselves. It's like, okay, well, we don't have to. Yeah.
like the Yucatan took forever to conquer because the Maya kept fighting these brutal guerrilla wars, and so the Spanish used the Tlaxcala to internally colonize the Yucatan. And so there's Tlaxcala place names in the Yucatan as examples. And certain native peoples fought way harder. The Chichimeca in central Mexico took 40 years to conquer because they were they were like a warrior steppe people that didn't have horses, although they got horses later. And inside the Spanish government system, the monarchy was largely parasitic, where the biggest thing Fehrenbach talks about is that he says the biggest issue with Mexico is infantilization. And you get to Mexican independence. This is a highly immature society. And we'll see why, but the reason Mexico had such an immature ruling class is because under the Spanish, only the Peninsulares could rule Mexico, and the Peninsulares were the Spanish from the peninsula of Spain. So the second you were born in Mexico, um, you were a second class citizen. And Mexico developed this complex racial caste system with the Peninsulares in positions of power. The Creoles, or the native whites, they were the dominant landowners and businessmen and that stuff. But they weren't allowed to have legitimate power. So they became obsessive over this very strange concept of honor. And honor is anthropologically a word that means completely different things in different contexts. The Chinese versus Celtic versus Latino concepts of honor are completely different things. But if I'm being honest, the Latino concept of honor is just kind of just being like being petty, where in early Mexico, you had all of these issues where you had certain political deals where people would sit at each other with their carriages pointed at each other, and they would refuse to sign the deal for days because whoever got out of their carriage first would dishonor themselves. Or the Spanish would dole out these titles to the Creole elite, and the Creole fought over these honorary titles because they had nothing else to do. And you had the Creoles on top, then you had the Indios. And the Indios were the Indians. And over the time period, in 1800, I think 80% of Mexicans were Indios at the time of independence, and now 10% of Mexicans are Indios. And the Spanish actually protected the Indios a lot, keeping them in this permanently infantilized position, where they didn't let the Indios have positions of power, they didn't let them become priests, they didn't let them even drink alcohol, and there were dozens of regulations, no, probably thousands of regulations of what the Indios could do. And the Indios actually became profoundly resentful that every single part of their life was circumscribed, where they were constantly treated like children, because this was a formerly incredibly proud people that had ruled these huge empires. And then there were a few blacks in Mexico in the area around the Gulf Coast, but they're like 2% of the population. And then you had the mestizos form. And the mestizos grew from being a tiny part of the population to the overwhelming majority. And the mestizos were hated, where they didn't fit into either the white or the Indio world. And there were no women, there were very few white women in Mexico, which is a huge difference in Latin America and Anglo-America, where Anglo-Americans are basically as white as Europeans, but because very few Spanish women came over, the conquistadors would have these harems of native women, which is why Mexico is 50-50 white native, where one Spanish guy beds 20 native women, so that's how the white genetics become disproportionate. And yes?
Do you think that's why they didn't invite the women over after they went there the first time? Because they're like, oh no, actually, we can't let our wives see this.
Let me think about that. So, one of the big reasons there wasn't mass migration from Spain to the New World in the same way there was from Britain to North America, because roughly half as many people migrated from Spain to the New World as from Britain to the 13 colonies, which matters because the Spanish New World stretches from Argentina to New Mexico and California. So it's a huge region, and it's because they didn't have capitalism. And the Indians already filled the bottom niches. Because if you're moving from Liverpool to Philadelphia, you can move there with the assumption that you can start up a trade, you can start a farm, but because the Spanish Empire wasn't capitalist, where you could only trade in these designated fleets, where they sailed from Seville to Veracruz, and then all trade had to operate within that bi-yearly fleet, and then the local lands were divided up by these huge encomienda, basically serf estates, where until very recently, the vast majority of Mexicans lived as serfs with practically no rights. Their landlords could whip them, rape them, work them however much they wanted. And so Mexico's got a history a lot like Russia due to the prevalence of serfdom. And so very few white people wanted to move to the New World because it was just this low growth society, which is why Mexico had such a large population in the pre-colonial period, but it took forever for Mexico's population to recover, while colonial America's population doubled every 15 years. Because they're just, all of all of a very high percentage of the extra resources that were extracted just went to the nobility, and they didn't have capitalism or property rights. So there was no incentive to just grow and have this virtuous economic cycle. So Mexico was stuck at this stagnating level where Mexico had 2 million people in 1600 and it had like 8 million people in 1800. And for a frame of reference, America's population, the 1 million British that migrated over in the colonial period have 100 million descendants today.
Yeah, that is a big difference. And I guess so they were stuck in a dynamic where the type of person who was going to go over there for an opportunity was not the kind of person with a family. Maybe it relates to your Russian Bitcoin salesman in Florida
Yeah.
kind of thing. Like you're expecting him to be more of a kind of bachelor opportunist, maybe than a whole community
Yes.
migration.
Yes. Slave societies have a tendency towards really bad behaviors that aren't just related to slavery. It's a big reason why the American Deep South scores the worst part of America on literally any statistic. Um, and it's Mexico isn't technically a slave society, but in a lot of ways it's very similar to a slave society. It's a serf society like Russia. And I don't want to make Mexico sound that bad because, especially in the 18th century, lots of Europeans were very impressed by Mexico because European tourists or explorers or adventurers or scientists would go to Mexico, and they were surprised at how high the standard of living was and how stable the society was, because this was an era of history that valued social stability for its own sake. And to keep in mind that the 18th century is a time period when Eastern Germany and Poland had mass serfdom, and those were societies that later had the Industrial Revolution just a few generations after. And so in the 18th century, it was a widely held opinion that Mexico could be a new America if you changed a few variables. That in the same
Right.
way that America was a society that everyone that went from a frontier to one of the most powerful places in the world, that Mexico could do the same. And it was only after independence that that Mexico you saw this huge differentiation in America and Mexico. And there it fluctuated a lot, where, as example, in the late 16th century, the average Mexican lived in absolutely horrific poverty because the slave system was that bad. And the Spanish also, they had mass conscription for the silver mines in central Mexico. And they would just get young men from across Mexico. And this just killed off, I think this killed off hundreds of thousands of local Mexicans, because if you were conscripted to go to the mines, it was a death sentence. You were assumed that you would never go back. And by the time you get to the early 18th century, Mexico actually had a very high standard of living because their population collapse had plateaued. And so they had this low population density that was artificially kept at certain levels due to the serf economy. So the serfs actually ate relatively well and lived in relatively good conditions.
Interesting. Well, even today, I think Mexicans are almost as fat as Americans.
They're more fat.
More fat, right? And
Yeah.
India is actually fairly close despite their levels of poverty. They
Progress.
eat a lot of butter, grease, or oil. I forget, ghee. But Yeah, that's so because I know in this 1600s period, the biggest cities, the biggest European cities in the Americas were in Mexico, or
Yeah.
at least one of them. And there's that one city that I always get the name wrong where the Japanese were coming through in the
Acapulco.
1600s. It was yeah, okay, yeah. It was very like how big was that city? It was because it was the international center of the world in the New World.
Yeah.
And I just feel like that's a really crazy, amazing time and environment, and that city's not really talked about that much. And I'm trying to figure it out in context of when did it switch from like one European to 100 natives to a 50-50 genetic mix.
So I can't find the stats for that. if the cities in Mexico were bigger, it's because there were no major cities in colonial America. Um,
Mm,
so interesting fact that you touched on that there was a Asian community in Western Mexico in the 18th century because the Philippines was a Spanish colony. And so from the galleons that went from Acapulco to Manila, there was this, and they called them the Chinese, but it also had Filipinos and Malays and those people in Western Mexico. And they introduced the dish ceviche to Mexico. And the Mexican nobility loved having Japanese prints. And the Mexican nobility would collect Japanese art. They were the first weebs.
right.
And and so there were those connections. Um, I think you probably got so in the year 1800, the vast majority of Mexicans were still Indios. And so the shift from a majority Indio society to a majority Mestizo society occurred over the course of the 19th century.
Okay, so kind of with industrial era population growth from the
Yes.
European populations.
I
So do you
also
have more immigration from Spain at that point?
you had some European immigration in the 19th century. I also
But also
don't
just
I also don't trust the population stats because Mexico is such an elitist society. They just barely consider the lower classes existed. Where the biggest difference in Mexico and America, not the biggest, there's lots of differences. One of the big differences is that America was a middle class society where it was split into different, very distinct subcultures. In the South, New England's the middle. Mexico had this unified elite. Actually, the entire Spanish Empire had a unified elite. Then you had these very distinct tribal populations that had very little in common. And part of the reason the Spanish keep the majority Indio population down is that the leadership class were all these Creoles, where if and these things were very common, where if an elite Spanish woman moved from Mexico City to Lima in Peru, thousands of miles away, she would enter into a culture that would seem very close to what she knew back home in Mexico. And through the unified elite culture, the local population were oppressed and under it. And there's a point I was trying to make there. I'm going to forget it though. The I would imagine the genetic tipping point actually occurred earlier than that because you did not see the only way you can get the 50-50 number is through mass polygamy in the part of the Spanish. And I don't think they were
mhm,
doing that in the 1800s after independence because
right.
the natives got more political authority with independence. So that just that sort of thing was no longer acceptable. Um, the other
So maybe
thing
polygamy into the industrial era where the cities are growing faster and the cities are more European.
possibly, I know that into the era of Porfirio Diaz, um, there was concubinage was a huge thing, and at the same time, a lot of the machismo in Latin American culture stems from having this Creole elite that had nothing to actually do. So they showed off their masculinity and sexual exploits. And as a general rule, a society which prizes masculinity based around sex is an innately emasculated society because true masculinity is killing dragons, conquering your enemies, discovering things, those
Right.
sorts of things. And so if your concept of masculinity is built around sexual conquests, it means your men don't have other outlets for masculinity, which is what's going on now.
It also necessitates that 9 out of the other 10 men are incels. So that
Exactly.
if one guy is the super Chad, so you have by default a less manly society.
If I was one of the local Mexican nobility, I would have literally just killed myself. I would not want to live in that Spanish world. It would just be too degrading. And the Spanish, so the mestizos, I want to focus on them, where a lot of Mexico's identity stems from the mestizo identity, where in Mexico's elite culture, you saw Mexico's got three different subregions, and I'm going to ridiculously oversimplify in the same way historians split America into the North, the South, and the West, which themselves have their own subcultures that are highly distinct. In Mexico, it's North, Middle, South. And Mexico is this gradient where the north of the country is like 80% white, and then the south of the country is like 80% native. And this is why the effects of Latino immigration have a lesser impact on America than America's genetic composition than people think, because America is actually selecting for the more white Latinos. The average Latino American's 2/3 European, and
That is funny. If it's 80%, technically North Mexican immigration would increase the level of whiteness in America.
yeah, and and so South Mexico is highly native, and these parts of Mexico I spent the most time in, like Oaxaca and the Yucatan, where you have these preformed native cultures that survived, and periodically, whenever Mexico was anarchy, the South forms into these. I don't want to call them communists because they're not ideological, into these bandits to just kill the plantation owners and reestablish native control. That's happened in the Yucatan and Oaxaca multiple times, and it's
Oh, the
why.
we don't need no stinking badges.
Exactly.
Mexican
That's
part of
in
the
that's in the
Mexican
north of
culture.
Mexico, though. Middle
Okay.
of Mexico it was the old Aztec core. In that area, the Creole elite established this highly advanced aristocratic culture, which is why so many of the cities of central Mexico are super nice. Where if you go to Puebla, if you go to Cuernavaca, it looks like Italy. Puebla and Cuernavaca literally have castles downtown with walls and towers, and then there's cobblestone streets with European style cafes. And lots of Mexico is built like 19th century French architecture because they loved the French and they had this white elite that were trying to imitate the Europeans.
Right, that's what I'm saying. There was something going on down there before North American settlement, similar to how the Quebec
Yeah.
architecture is pretty medieval, and it was early. And so it sounds like they were literally using those castles to effectively conquer. They were conquering with castles and horses and swords
Yes.
for like 100, 200 years, where it's kind of like I don't feel like we have a really. I would like to see some movies around that time period or something just to get an idea of it because it's a little bit of a fantasy
Yeah.
world.
The Latino sphere is artificially stuck in the medieval level of development, where the Spanish banned the printing press, they banned Protestantism, scientific thinking, and so the Catholic Church had a complete monopoly on all education and most thought, and so um, Mexico had this fossilized version of the Middle Ages, and I don't like saying that because medieval Europe itself was actually a highly dynamic, scientific, forward-thinking society. So it's this sort of just fossilized medieval period, and it had this feudalism that lasts basically until today. Mexico's is only like one step away from feudalism even now,
But they
and
just recently, in the last 10 years, was the first time in over a century that they moved on from single party rule.
yes, exactly. And the Latinos really have an issue with regulation, and this is what the Spanish did, where every single subcomponent of Spanish life was regulated. Your racial caste determined what you did. Your city had different legislation, and it just every single element of life was bureaucratized. Um, and so you have the center of Mexico, which had this highly cultured Creole elite, and then this huge disaffected um, uh, Indio population beneath them. And to the north of them was the frontier, where Mexico had its own frontier period comparable to America, where they had to fight the tribes of North Mexico in the desert. Um, and mestizos became the majority in the north because you saw the mixing up of the strict social hierarchies further south due to how frontier cultures work. And Mexico had its own cowboys, and a lot of cowboy culture actually stems from Mexico. And this is why so many of Mexico's most important leaders in the early 20th century were from the north of Mexico, like Sonora, where you had the Sonora clique during the time of the Revolution, because on the Mexican frontier, you saw the ability to realize new social structures not dependent upon the old feudalism, which is why Mexico's industrial hub is at Monterrey, which is right south of Texas. And the reason Monterrey became Mexico's industrial center is that the governor, I believe, of the province of Nueva Leon, which is where it is, he ended the debt slavery peonage system, where until the early 20th century, almost all Mexicans lived in permanent debt slavery to their landlords. They weren't allowed to leave the land. No matter how much money they made, it went to the lord. And so he ended debt slavery. So the peasants left the land, moved to the city, started working in factories. And in Sonora, you saw these huge industrial haciendas or plantations with cattle and agriculture that could form because proximity to the US rubbed off a lot of Americanized attitudes onto Mexico, like capitalism or independence from or individualism or those things. And the rest of
Mhm.
Mexico like to call the Norteños honorary Americans.
Well, it's like you mentioned with the collectivist attitude before, and how easily the Spanish shifted into that because they're not used to thinking outside of an authority structure.
Yeah,
And you can't underestimate how pervasive like a mentality like that can get throughout a whole society.
yeah,
So it's interesting to see that that's the point where they kind of started to transition from that and awaken from this go there, go here, 400-year slumber. Um,
the
and yeah, go ahead, you go.
Oh, the thing with mestizos as well is that mestizos were called bandits for most of the colonial period, where mestizo was synonymous with criminal because the society was so stratified and it was so bureaucratized that if you didn't belong to a pre-established racial group, you had no place in the society. So the people who were neither Indian nor white, they existed on the fringes of Mexican society until they
Mhm.
became the majority. And so
And then it broke all at once
yes.
or
And
whatever. Yeah.
there's this profound resentment inside Mexico from the mestizo heritage, where Mexico's always had this identity issue where they're neither European nor native, and the Mexicans have constantly tried to oscillate over what their identity is. At certain times, they thought they were Spanish, at certain times, they thought they were native, and the problem is they're actually neither. They're Mexican, they're something new. And the only way the Mexicans can form an identity is by letting go of the past, but letting go of the past is also innately very dangerous because you need some new grounding. And once we're going to get to the independence period, we're going to see how the governance of Mexico by shitlibs backfired.
Yeah, that is a really tricky dynamic to navigate because you could just see the narrative falling apart if they
That's
tried to pretend they were Spanish or if they tried to pretend the other way
yeah,
because of everything that's tied up in the story. And then yeah, then you also have people living in Mexico who are totally Spanish, and not only are they totally Spanish, but they have actually connections back to their family in Spain,
our
like our
mutual
friend.
friend.
Yeah,
Don't say his
and
name.
yeah, exactly. And then yeah, and they're so you got these Iberian Celts, and I know a lot of Iberians went over as conquistadors because that was the region of Spain that the and nice that
Yeah,
the conquistadors came from was the Iberian warrior sailor Celtic culture, and so you have like it's surprising enough that you have Celts in Spain, but
yeah,
you have Celts, Spanish Celts in Mexico that have family in Spain who play weird bagpipes and wear kilts.
yes.
Like
I
that's a real thing.
So in colonial diasporas, first of all, say hi to Walter. Walter is a
What's up,
capybara.
Walter?
Um, so, um, the in colonial societies, diasporas are disproportionate, which is why the Scottish and the Irish are disproportionate in America, as well as the rural regions of England, rather than London and the hub of England. And in Spain, it was the Asturians, the Galicians, the Sephardic Jews, and the Moors who were overrepresented. Interestingly, the Catalans were vastly underrepresented because they were a different monarchy from Castile with their own culture. And so Galicians and Basques are vastly overrepresented in Latin American populations than they are in Spain. Because Galicia, or the Celtic area, is to Spain what Wyoming is to America. Um, and this is, yes,
Well, yeah, this is exactly the same as how the Irish and Scottish diaspora multiplied drastically
yes,
in North America where there's not that many of them left in the UK versus the English is more matches evenly.
So this is the last thing I'm going to cover before independence, where um, the Greater Mexico stretched from Costa Rica up to like Colorado in California, where the north of Mexico was not really habited by settlers until the end of the 19th century. But then the Spanish punctured across the northern desert, where they established colonies in New Mexico, California, and Texas. And they mostly built these so as to prevent other Europeans from colonizing the region. Where for California, which they settled around the same time as the American Revolution, they built it because there was a Russian fort outside San Francisco called Fort Ross. And so San Francisco, St. Francis, Los Angeles, the Angels, San Diego, St. Diego, you can tell this is a highly Catholic society. And in Texas, they built it against the French in Louisiana. New Mexico, there was the native Puebla population, who were the only large farmer population that the Spanish could enslave. And so in Texas, they built San Antonio, St. Antonio. They built San Marcos, St. Marcos. Just pick any Catholic saint, and it'll be a city in somewhere in Spanish Hispano-America. But the Spanish Southwest was very lightly populated. Latino Texas had like 3,000 people, same thing as California, same thing as New Mexico. And in Spanish Texas, it was so poor that the governor lived in the jail because it was the only sturdy building. And on top of that, they were still using pike cavalry into the 19th century, while across the entire Southwest, they were fighting a defensive war against the highly aggressive and capable native peoples like the Comanche, the Apache, and the Navajo, who built these basically Mongol warrior confederacies that were larger than European countries. And so San Antonio was this walled monastery where the church would had a nasty practice of insurfing the local natives against their own consent, but at the same time the natives loved the church and converted to the church with glee. And because the church was the one group of people who viewed the natives as even slightly human. And so, and also, I mean, Catholicism is just a nicer religion than Huitzilopochtli. And so the natives became Catholic very quickly, and very devout Catholics where they loved the church. And the 19th century Mexicans getting rid of the church it was a profoundly anti-native move. But the Mexicans had this outcropping in the American Southwest that was declining and very peripheral to them, but it's the foundation of the modern Southwest.
Yeah, that is like I mentioned in the Frontier episode about how there was Kit Carson, the American guys exploring West, ended up fighting Spanish people on horses with pikes.
Yeah.
Like, so that was the last of the guys who had just spent hundreds of years conquering South America. Just like this historical remnant, but still effective. Like they got beaten by the
Yes.
pike horsemen. And and then there's this basically flag planting all over the Pacific and Mexican area. But as soon as a population showed up, then all the flag planting didn't really matter.
Now for Mexican independence. Mexico never really had a war of independence, quote unquote, where what happened is that in the Napoleonic Wars, France conquered Spain and Napoleon installed one of his brothers as the King of Spain. The Mexican elite didn't really want independence from Spain because they were dependent on Spain to keep the natives down. But then what happened is that as the Spanish government fell apart, and the new Spanish government that reformulated were liberals who believed in democracy, and the Mexican elite were highly conservative. They hated democracy. They didn't want the locals to vote. And they broke off functionally from Spain, although they still want to be part of the Spanish monarchy. And the first step of the Mexican War of Independence was this is so embarrassing. I'm forgetting his name. I've read like 5 books on this guy. Mexican War of Independence figures. Um, this
Some guy with a blue hat had a feather in
He
it.
was a priest.
Yellow buck.
Okay,
Oh, I got it wrong.
it was Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla. Okay, people call him Hidalgo. So Hidalgo was this Creole local priest who was also a radical liberal. And liberal meant classical. Actually, no, liberal meant the same thing back then as now in the Mexican context. But
Right.
he was this liberal, and he was really angry at how the Spanish treated the natives poorly, and the natives loved the church. So Hidalgo formed this army of native people who rebelled, and they wanted to turn Spain into a society without legal, they wanted to turn Mexico into a society without legal racial castes, where it was a free society with the destruction of all the different private interests that the Bourbon monarchy had established. And so he launched this army, and he nearly marched on Mexico City because the army swelled to really large sizes. But the problem is that the military it wasn't that well led, and he kind of dawdled around where he didn't take Mexico City when he could. And he kept wandering around the land, just taking resources. And what happened was that Hidalgo provoked this reaction amongst the Creole elite, where they wiped him out. Where the Mexican War of Independence is a multiple tiered thing, and it killed 10 times as many people as the American War of Independence, although Mexico and America had comparable populations at the time, because the Mexican War of Independence became this horrific race war where the breakdown of the Spanish monarchy meant all of these resentments simmered up, where the British colonies were functionally independent beforehand, and that wasn't true in Mexico. And so Hidalgo was the first tier, and then what you saw occur afterwards is that there were multiple warlords who gathered factions between different subregions of Mexico, where Morelos, as an example, he was a guerrilla commander, I believe, coming out of it was one of the states next to Oaxaca. It might be Guerrero, and he was, as far as I remember, he was one of the more moral players, where he tried to build Mexico as around a more stable. Fact check me on this. Try to build Mexico around a more stable state that was a liberal. It was a liberal. He was a functional liberal, and then
Oh yeah, the one that started their single party state in the late 1800s.
different.
Is
So
that where
there's
we are?
two Mexican war. There's two Mexican wars. There's the war in early 1800s and then late 1800s. They're different
Got it.
wars. And the problem with Mexican wars is they always occur through multiple. They're built around these cults of personality, or the caudillos, and then the caudillos get these rough approximations of political positions where they're really serving the interests of them and their buddies. And then they seize power, they burn out because entropy was the biggest issue in Mexico because they didn't know how to self-govern. And so they and so they try to change the system, and then the entropy of the system ultimately destroys them.
Got it. And then so do you have three groups at this point? Like the Spanish nobility, the mixed, and then the Indians. And in the 1800s, early 1800s, how did those factions line up in that war? Was it so you got the nobility, uh who got the middle on their side in that war?
There was no middle class. What effectively occurred is that over time, the modern Mexican country was not established by these heroic cults of personality who are leading these Robin Hood battalions of natives and mixed people. It occurred because the white Creole nobility realized that um, they would have to band together to hold the rest of the population down. And as Spain as a country stopped having the ability to exert power, the Mexican nobility formed Mexico as this country under white dominance in order to maintain their power with the collapse of the Spanish system. So after these cults of personality had failed through these horrific wars, And after all of the forces of liberal social justice had died out,
Mhm.
you saw this reversion to the continuation of the Spanish social structure, just without the Spanish.
Got it. Okay, so basically they managed to keep the old system consistent for a while up until we get to the late 1800s war.
Yes. So established an effective constitution and congressional system, but he lost due to the constant forces of entropy and backstabbing. So he's been looked back upon as later Mexican historians as this potential George Washington figure that failed. I don't have that much faith in Latin American governments. I don't think Mexico, even if it had incredible leadership, could have become
Mhm.
America because a
Mhm.
singular leader can't break the trajectories. Um,
Right.
but after the independence from Spain, Mexico was effectively a failed state for the middle of the 19th century. And this is a really weird period of history. One, which I'll explain because they had the differentiation between the right and the left, but their right and left are not our right and left, where they had the continuistas, and then you
Mhm.
had the leftists. And their conservatives were capitalist and technologically progressive, but they were also monarchists. So their conservatives are that we should establish a monarchy and then import Europeans, deregulate the economy, and then industrialize. And their idea was that Mexico was not ready for a democracy, and they had to experience they had to experience a commercial revolution first. And the liberals were basically shit libs. And I use the term shit lib as like Rousseau leftist, where you have the
Mhm.
Eastern left and the Western left. And the Latin sphere, and I'm including France, they have their own variety of leftist that we don't really have in America. It's this combination of romantic, anti capitalist, pro emotional expression, feminine, French Revolution style leftist. So the liberals in Mexico were French Revolution style, where their goal was mass centralization. They were technically federalists, but the reality is that they really wanted a centralized government to standardize all of Mexico. And they stood for reason and they stood for the unification as Mexican citizens. And there's multiple ironies going on here. One irony is that when the liberals gained power, they actually ended up indirectly hurting the natives because they would get rid of the native special rights. They would create a single Mexican country that destroyed the
Mhm.
independent native privileges. So the natives actually suffered under the liberals, and the liberals got rid of the church several times, which was one of the few social institutions that held Mexico together. The conservatives at the same time, they were um, the conservatives fell out, and of course, you guys know my bias. Of these two factions, I would have probably been a conservative in this equilibrium. But I say my biases so you can take them and ignore them if you want to. But the conservatives, they had the first flush of leadership under Santa Anna, who is this strange Chad where the relationship between Santa Anna and the Mexican nation is like a bad boy boyfriend with a girl in a toxic relationship. Where, as an example, Santa Anna seized power multiple times, and he was an officer under, I believe, Iturbide, who is the Creole commander who got Mexico to form its country from the Spanish. Santa Anna multiple times seized power, got bored of power, and then just dicked off to do his own thing. And there were multiple times where he lost power, showed up to Mexico, made an impassioned speech. The Mexican people loved him so much, reinstalled him in power, only for him to make an issue. And he declared himself emperor, and then he wasn't actually able to maintain power. And I can't remember all the details of Santa Anna's biography. You should look him up on Wikipedia. There was a time when he was holding against a French blockade in Veracruz, and the French shot off his leg with a cannonball, so he walked around with a wooden peg leg for a lot of his career. And and he had constant affairs, and he started the war in Texas indirectly, where the Mexicans imported in the Anglo Americans to populate Texas because Texas had very few people. But within a few years, there were 10 times as many Anglo Americans as local Mexicans. And the Anglo
Right.
Americans asked for political independence. And the Mexicans were originally very conciliatory to the Anglos. But then
Right.
the Anglos didn't understand the Latino concept of honor, so the Mexicans took them asking for independence as a slight. And I think I actually had an ancestor who was part of the Texas delegation to Mexico in that war. Um,
Yeah.
and so he started the war with he was part of that whole process with the Texan War of Independence, where he led an army up to the Alamo, which beat the Texans, and the Texans beat him at San Jacinto, and Santa Anto was largely responsible for Mexico's loss in the Mexican American War, where at the time people didn't people didn't know that America would end up becoming a vastly stronger country than Mexico by any conceivable metric. So a lot of commentators actually thought Mexico would win that war. And what happened is that the Americans wiped Mexico out within a few years. They took out Texas, took out California, took out New Mexico. Then the Americans sent an army to Veracruz under Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor, marched over the mountains, took the capital, Mexico City, which is on top of Old Tenochtitlan. And one of the great parts of Mexican mythology is when the military cadets at Chapultepec, which I've been to, they charged the Americans and all got slaughtered. So one of the seminal moments of Mexican mythology is losing so hard to the Americans. And in the book Fehrenbach has, he calls it the death of honor because beforehand Mexican culture had prized this concept of dignity and that they were innately superior, where they saw the Americans as savages. They called them Goths or Vikings and those things. And after they lost so hard to the Americans, Mexico spiraled into this inferiority complex where they couldn't justify their earlier noble aristocratic pretensions.
But then when we became way more powerful than Europe, did that help them be able to re-identify as Spanish again because they were not uniquely defeated? I guess that's kind of a joke, but
Mexico's gone
is
through multiple identities. In the period initially after Mexican independence, the white elite identified a lot with the Aztecs, which is strange because they were the least Aztec demographic. And then in the era under Porfirio Diaz, they identified as European. And then in the 20th century, they identified as native again. So they've oscillated between this.
right.
And Mexico, the effect from America due to commercialization, which occurred in the 20th century, has affected Mexico as profoundly as the Spanish colonization did in the 16th century.
Yeah, that makes sense because it forced a big change in the society. And I mean, we have to make the obvious French Revolution comparison here because the factions are the
Yes.
continuars of the monarchy versus like the Rousseauian left. Um, and so, yeah, they're stuck in that paradigm, like you said. Liberal in that sense would have been fairly close to how we mean liberal in the modern world. And
Yes.
basically, when your society is overwhelmed with these values, your options are either a strong man or like leftist catastrophe. And so the only solution out of the scenario is to establish a clear alternate value, which North America was able to do through its connection with England and the classic tradition.
Yes. After Santa Anna had discredited the conservatives, France invaded Mexico, where Mexico was a failed state with all the independent subparts spiraling into effectively different countries under local warlords or caudillos. And the Mexicans were completely broke. And France was in one of their colonial periods where they were trying to recover their ego from the loss of the Napoleonic Wars. And so the French were eyeing Mexico, where they thought this is a former colony only a generation ago of a European country. It's got minerals, it's underdeveloped. And so because the Mexicans defaulted on their debts, the French sent an army under Maximilian to conquer Mexico. And Maximilian was a Habsburg. He was a German Habsburg.
Hmm.
And they were actually able to conquer Veracruz in Mexico City. And the pre established Mexican conservative elite actually approved of Maximilian, which is something that you'll never get anyone to say. Um, and
Makes sense because it
yeah,
restores their connection to Europe, which is what
yes.
really they were stressed out after they lost that.
And the Mexicans got one of their best leaders, Juarez, who was a pureblood Indian from Oaxaca, and he is their first Indian leader. And he fought a pretty heroic war. He was a liberal, and he solidified generations of Mexican liberal leadership. And through that, he was able to hold Mexico together when few others could have. And the French ultimately ended up losing because the Americans, after the end of the US Civil War, pressured the French to leave. They said, we have this huge field army we just conquered the Confederacy with. We can march it over the Rio Grande. And so the French had to pull out, which left Maximilian by himself. And then Maximilian was shot.
Right. And
Ironically,
then, yeah, you
Maxim-
finish that.
Maximilian was considered not brutal enough because he was part of that 19th century Romantic tradition, and so he wasn't willing to get into the nitty gritty of these different warlord factional disputes. And if he did, he probably would have won
And why didn't he want to get into the nitty gritty of that again?
because he was
The
soft.
oh well, that'll do it. Um, yeah, so they lost their and then Germany kind of tried to make an alliance with Mexico during World War II, and that was kind of the last one. It's interesting to see the connection between the Habsburgs and the Germans later, and
Yes,
just the constant opportunism to make a European connection where there wasn't one, because it's not
yes,
like you could do that in the U.S. where it's obviously connected to England.
yes,
Um, but there was an opportunity for a general, just someone to work with the nobility. And then just real quick to make the comparison, to finish the French comparison, Santa Anna sounds exactly like Napoleon.
yes,
Conquered, exiled, conquer some stuff, exiled. It's just funny to see that so many elements of that pattern matching up. And this being the broad context of South American politics is stuck
yes,
between Hobbes and Rousseau without the ability to establish Locke. So
yes.
it's just cool to see all these connections.
Santa Anna is Diet Napoleon. He's
Yeah.
Napoleon Light. Um, and the So that's a great transition because out of Juarez came Porfirio Diaz, and Diaz is a polarizing figure in Mexico today because the Mexican right likes Diaz and the Mexican left dislikes him, which is funny because I believe Diaz came from Juarez's posse, and Diaz straddled the line where he was technically a liberal, but at the same time he was really a conservative. And I have a friend who lives in Mexico where his rule is he only dates girls who support Porfirio Diaz because he said if a girl is willing to accept Diaz, she is willing to accept something that's good enough but kind of has bad optics. And Diaz Diaz is polarizing because he was the guy who got Mexico to get the first step of the Industrial Revolution, where he made all these corrupt deals with the local warlords just to get Mexico to be a unified country. And he optimized Mexico for foreign investment. So he basically bent his back over to make Mexico as attractive as possible to foreign investors. And their influence mostly came from Europe, not America, where French and British and German capital went into Mexico, where you saw mass plantations arise. You saw the original tapping of the Mexican oil industry. You saw factories getting built in Mexico. And so Mexico saw this breakthrough towards industrialization and modernization that got Mexico to stop being a failed state. And the reason he is a divisive figure is that through this process, you saw the rise of enormous inequality because Mexico didn't get rid of serfdom, where the average Mexican at the start of the 20th century, where Diaz ruled for 30 years, was significantly poorer than he was a century earlier. Where the average Mexican, where this growth in foreign capital caused mass population growth, which caused Malthusian pressures. Where I don't really
Yeah.
blame Diaz per se for the poverty. It's just that the first stage of industrialization always causes inequality, which is the robber baron phase. Then it percolates downwards, and Mexico is going through the natural Malthusian patterns. And
Yeah.
so, yes,
Oh, this is the issue with foreign investment is if you don't have, and foreign investment is not bad, but just issue in a sense of the example. If you don't have the social institutions to generate your own industrial revolution, but there
yes,
are more advanced nations around you that can find a way to make development work within your country, when you get that and the rest of your social institutions aren't evolved to it, the growth is going to be extremely imbalanced and create
yes,
these Malthusian traps. So that's what
exactly,
we're seeing a lot of the developing world deal with right now. Um,
yes.
yeah,
And um, Diaz's reign saw the development of the fringes of Mexico, where the Mexicans finally beat the peoples of the Northwest and populated Sonora, which became the wealthiest part of Mexico. Sonora is across from Arizona. And they defeated the Apache and the Yaqui. And the north of Mexico is where the growth is most concentrated with these huge industrial grade haciendas and the manufacturing in Monterrey, and the Yucatan, which is the poorest part of Mexico. Mexico's wealth gradient is north south, much like its ethnic gradient. And so the Yucatan, I believe, has 1/4 the total GDP per capita of Sonora. It's that pronounced. And the Yucatan saw these huge agricultural plantations, which produced this ludicrously wealthy elite who would do stuff like they would send their clothes to Europe they would just casually get shopping from Europe, and when they got their clothes dirty, they just buy new clothes from Europe. And Diaz himself felt kind of grossed out by the decadence of the Mexican white elite, which saw itself as an extension of Europe removed from the local population. But Diaz's reign is marked by lots of kind of gross compromises, which got Mexico to stop being a failed state. And the average Mexican was incredibly poor, suffered malnutrition. There was like a lot of Mexicans worked like 7 days a week, and there was horrific sexual depredations and that stuff. And bubbling up under the surface came the Mexican Revolution, which is a horrifically bloody war. And the Mexican Revolution came about because Diaz faced this son of a wealthy family who was really into spirituality, who was a liberal leader, and he Diaz would run these fake elections, and it's so embarrassing. I keep on forgetting these names. Mexican Revolution names. I apologize, Mexicans. I know. I promise I know the history. Just forget the names. Mexican Revolution leaders. It was Madero. That's it. So Madero ran against Diaz, and he was surprisingly successful. And Diaz was an older man. He just threw Madero in jail, and he didn't think about it because he threw so many people in jail. And then this sparked this horrific war that rippled across Mexico, where Mexico went from a society that seemed incredibly peaceful to an incredibly bloody war, which I think it killed millions of people. It's the bloodiest war in the Americas, I believe, excepting maybe the War of the Triple Alliance in Paraguay, which killed 80% of Paraguay's population, the same time of the U.S. Civil War. Different
right.
story. And you saw Mexico split into the three different brackets, where the Zapatistas were these rebels in the south of the country who formed these bandit armies that just burned the plantations, that took over Oaxaca and Guerrero and Yucatan. And then you saw the Sonora clique, which included Pancho Villa, who's become this mythic figure, who was this cowboy warlord who had a bandit army, as well as Obregon and Carranza. And these were all different factions, and the Mexican Revolution could be Game of Thrones, because there's so many different sub-factions that believe in things, where they were mostly unified by Marxist politics. This is one of the things people forget, where Mexico in the 1920s had their own equivalent to a Marxist revolution. And the reason we don't know that is because the US was fighting World War I, and the US said, hey, Mexico, if you call yourself, and this is what the Oxford History of Mexico says. He said, if you call you, Woodrow Wilson said, if you call yourself Marxist, we have to invade you. So don't call yourself Marxist because we don't want to have to
Uh,
justify a war to our own population.
right.
And
Talk about domino theory starting
yeah,
in Mexico. It's
exactly.
already there. It's going to knock us over.
And so you saw Pancho Villa's army make it close to Mexico City. You saw them attack the centralized government under the remnants of Diaz's regime. Then that regime fell. Then you saw Carranza fight against his fellow Sonoran Pancho Villa. And in the end, Pancho Villa attacked Arizona because he was getting tired. The Americans stopped backing him because we saw that Carranza would be the rising figure. And so Pancho Villa was wiped out. And then you saw the unification of Mexico into this socialist state where you saw the breakdown of the old European feudal structure, where the start of the 20th century, the mestizos gained power over Mexico for the first time ever. And a lot of the land, they created these communist land grants where the state had the land and then the natives were the employees of the state, where, like everywhere else, um, socialist revolution did not actually result in the population getting better off. It lessened the population pressures and the envy of inequality that occurred under the Diaz regime. And funnily enough, a quarter of the budget for the new revolutionary regime was put into education, but the average Mexican only became literate in the mid 20th century because all of the education went into revolutionary propaganda. And they were radically anti Christian, so they illegalized the Catholic Church. And there was a war called the Cristero War in the west of the country, where the Sonorans were anti religious, but in the Indian western parts of the country, Catholicism was deeply entrenched, and these Catholic rebels fought against the centralized government. And because the Cristeros were backed by the U.S., they actually changed and they won, and then they re-legalized Catholicism. And so for the entire 20th century, from the 20s to the 90s, Mexico was under this one-party state that was vaguely left-wing, but they never really committed to communism, where every Mexican regime
Who does?
has to have these broadband coalitions where they stretch from the radical left to moderate conservatives because Mexico is so mountainous and diverse and it's so broken up that it's impossible to have a singular Mexican regime without an incredibly wide coalition. And so Mexico was kind of this lame. I just shouldn't say lame. I'd rather live in a lame dictatorship than a hard dictatorship. Mexico was this soft authoritarianism where the average Mexican lived in horrific poverty. And Mexico was vaguely a U.S. ally, but it also wasn't. And Mexico started to loosen up in the 1960s, where the student protests of the 60s had a bigger effect in Mexico than elsewhere because Mexico had no pre-established institutions of free thought or student universities or those things. And over the course of the mid to late 20th centuries, Mexico started to see the commercialization of society coming from the US, where the north of Mexico was more closely connected to America than it was the rest of Mexico. And the Americans built these factories called maquiladoras across the border to make stuff cheaply with Mexican labor and ship it back to America. And Americans built tourist facilities in Acapulco. And it's crazy that some of the wealthiest tourists in the world go to Acapulco in Guerrero province, one of the poorest province of Mexico, and Cancun similar, where Quintana Roo is one of the poorest provinces of Mexico. And America has had profound effects on Mexico, where we are changing their society, where their old feudal aristocratic system can't hold up against the American Industrial Revolution because we bring too much destabilization and chaos, where Mexicans started seeing Coca-Cola, and I think Mexico is the country in the world which consumes the most Coca-Cola per capita. Mexicans got cars. Mexico experienced the Industrial Revolution. And I'm actually profoundly optimistic about Mexico in the future. I think by the end of this century, Mexico will become one of the most important countries in the world.
Yeah. it sounds like their regional differences have were not wiped out by the communist
No.
revolution, so they'll keep reforming. And you know it was a communist revolution because they banned the church. There was an
Yes.
unusually high death toll, and a lot of bureaucracy popped up afterwards. So you
Yes.
put two and two together. And in terms of right now, yes, it's very interesting because Mexico's place ties into both our bureaucracy and their bureaucracy, where
Yes.
they increasingly see themselves as they increasingly see an opportunity for development. And a lot of the previous US elite realized, there was a problem with outsourcing and maybe a problem with becoming entirely dependent on China. And their great plan to save America was move the manufacturing from Asia into Mexico because
Yes.
removing our own bureaucracy was inconceivable. Now the plan has shifted to where we're actually trying to remove our own bureaucracy and not just shift everything to Mexico. And the significance of shifting to Mexico is not just the political implications of China, but the fact that you cut out trans-Pacific shipping. And that's
Yes.
10% of manufacturing revenue on average when labor costs only differ by 3%. So getting that in Mexico close is a big change, but you need to have Mexico capable of producing similar things. And now we're not going to be solely reliant on Mexico as a plan B since we can actually manufacture at home, which is nice. And the other plan was a little bit sad.
Mexico is a highly regional society, you're correct, even today. Where if you go to the Mexican parliament, it's a really shitty area. The downtown capital of Mexico City is this bizarre ghost town that's really eerie. The nicest parts of Mexico City are towards the west, around Chapultepec. And the reasoning for that is that Mexico is highly regionally governed due to the cartels, where in the last generation, Mexico saw one enormous, very positive, and one enormous, very negative trend. The negative trend was the rise of the cartels, due to the American need for drugs, where Mexico did not have stable rule of law, and thus the cartels seized effective control over most of Mexico, more so than even the government in a lot of cases, where Mexico's got a really big crime issue, and I can't overstate that, where more people die in Mexico every year due to the drug war than people die in actual wars like Syria. And it's why Mexico, out of the top 10 most violent cities in the world, Mexico has the most of any, and it wouldn't surprise me if a majority of the top 10 are in Mexico. So Mexico's got a real issue with that. Mexico's
Yeah.
also got a huge literacy issue. It's got a huge bureaucracy issue. Mexico has serious problems. And this video is too long. I've got plenty of crazy Mexico stories that illustrate the issues Mexico has. At the same time, Mexico saw the Industrial Revolution, where having lived in Mexico, if you're of a certain like social type, Mexico is a nicer society to live in than America. And they don't
Mhm.
have a lot of the issues we have, like wokeness or just rampant silliness, because they're too poor to be silly. And even not even just the north of Mexico, lots of Mexico's industrialized. If you drive around Mexico City, it doesn't look like Vietnam. Lots of Mexico City looks more like America's level of development than Vietnam's level of development. And
Totally.
Mexico is a huge class bifurcated society. So when Americans go, they tend to see the nice expat areas and they ignore Mexico's issues. But Mexico is clearly developing. And I think Peter Zeihan's got a good take here, where as America becomes more isolationist due to MAGA, um, Mexico is probably one of the few countries we can still maintain trade with because we are balanced where they are poorer and younger, and we are wealthier, more technologically advanced, and older, where I would like us to move our factories back to America, not to Mexico. But no matter what, there's still going to be some factories in Mexico
Right.
because they have this underlying cheap labor in proximity to America that America doesn't.
Yeah, we're going to develop a lot together. And the Mexico plan was that I referenced was something Peter Zion used to talk about is
Yeah.
where we're going to be okay, we're going to be safe against China because we can do all our manufacturing in Mexico. And it's like, guys, that's such a sad vision. Can we make it possible to manufacture in the US also? And
We're
the Mexican bureaucracy is funny because it's it's more efficient in its maintenance of oligarchy and less broad in a helicopter parent
Yes.
style. So there's things you can do in Mexico that you can't do in the U.S. But their system is also pretty good at maintaining their oligarchy.
Mexico is the country in the world where the highest percent of the population is paid a bribe to get something done, more so than
Yeah.
any other country in Latin America. And the amount of journos and politicians who get shot in every election in Mexico is horrifying. So Mexico's got very serious issues, and a lot of Mexicans are still illiterate today. The ones who are literate often read at a barely middle school level, and it's got a lot of issues. But at the same time, my hope is that over the course of our lifetimes, the legitimate trade will be large enough that it can counterbalance the cartels in the same way that Southern Italy and Ireland gradually getting wealthier is what got rid of the power of the IRA or the mafia.
Yeah, good point. And I'm trying to think of how it's also you have the big consumer market in the US for drugs, and
Yeah.
then you have the prohibitions, and then you have the supply coming from South America. So
Yes.
that's a big part of it. But like you said, I think development will overwhelm even that incentive
So, uh,
to a degree.
we're done now. This video was too long. I like that the video, I think our videos are getting too long now. I think the audience doesn't mind that much. If you comments, say if these videos are getting too long or you like the length. Um, Next video, I'm going to give you choices. Do you want the Pax Romana, the Napoleonic Wars, or Latin American history in general?
Um, Oh my gosh, I'm evenly split between all three because Pax Romana relates to the Empire stuff. We have the Napoleon connections, and then obviously the broad Latin American.
Yeah,
I want to talk about all three. What's a
we're doing Latin America.
yeah, that's a maybe that's a better order. All right, Latin America.
Okay, adios.
All right, adios amigos.